Mabuhay, kapisanan, kasaysayan, Pilipinas. Makasaysayang gabi po sa ating lahat. Ako po si Xiao Chu, isang public historian. Welcome to Vibal Group, Kasaysayan, Kaysaya. Iyan, mga kaibigan. Makasaysayang gabi sa ating lahat. Okay, so bukas po ay araw ng kagitingan. Kaya meron po tayong paggunita ngayon sa ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig. Bagamat ang araw ng kagitingan po ay para sa lahat ng veterano at actually nagtanggol sa ating soberanya at kasarinlan, no? Sa mga nagdaang mga taon at panahon. Diba? So parang National Heroes Day din siya, kumbaga. No? Pero gumugunita ito dun sa tayo yung pinakahuling sumuko sa mga Hapones nung ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig, doon sa tinatawag nating pagbagsak ng bataan na nagpapakita ng ating kagitingan. Hindi ng pagkatalo, kundi ng kagitingan. Dahil after 3 years, parang si Jesus Christ, sabi nga doon sa speech na bataan has fallen. Parang si Jesus Christ lang yan. Oh, parang si Jesus Christ lang. Ibig sabihin lang, after 3 days, mabubuhay ulit tayo. No? Yun na nangyari. Di ho ba? No? So, yun. Mga kaibigan, maraming salamat po sa inyong panonood. Sige, batiin muna natin yung ating mga kasama sa Vibal. Siyempre, nandiyan ho, ang El Presidente, no? Gaspar Vibal, no? Nandiyan po, no? Binabati ko po kayo. Gayon din, si Christine Mandigma, Rio Brihino Lim, no? Kim Carlo Rente, Benis Balboa de la Cruz, Jessa Pumar, Sara Sunga, Richard Lyle Dino, at of course si Bujay Sedutan. Ayan. Tama na sana itong pagkakasabi ko ng iyong pangalan at hindi ko minamarder sa kada episode ng ating Kasaysayan Kaysaya. Pasensya ka na, no? Bujay. Ayan. So, si Jessa Pumar, kasama ko nung isang araw. Kasama natin si yung mga kaibigan natin sa Philippine Book Development, tama ba? NBDB, National Book Development Board, nagkaroon tayo ng pagkakataon na makakasama, no, para sa ating bisita iglesia at paggunita kay Severino Reyes, no? So, yun, no, si Anthony John Balisi, ang director, no, ng National Book Development Board. Binabati po natin. Yun, sige. Sino ba mga early bird natin? There are already 49 watchers, no? Gabriel. Si yung paborito ko signer Lumalab Life, no? Lumalab Life. Tony Francisco, hello po, no? Si Amy Adiwang, hello. Oo. Ayan, Lumalab Life, no? Tony Francisco. Siyempre batiin natin yung nanay ko, no? Vilma Briones Chua. At sino pa ba? Siyempre tatay ko si Charles Chua. Lahat na lang, si Chow Chua, nakasama ko sila kahapon, no? Si Tat Daddy at saka si Michelle kasama ko. Nanood kami ng Miss Saigon ni Michelle Chow Chua, no? Nitong nakaraan. At gayon din, nandyan din si Mark, si Faye, at si Mace. Si Mace at saka si Cash. No? Pamangkin ko, Mace at saka Cash. Hello. Oh. lumalaki. Siyempre, binabati ko rin, no? May Orozco ng Department of Education, Bureau of Education Assessment. Hello po. Ayan, ayan. Hello, hello. Ay, Gabriel. Karen Joy Cadiz, magandang gabi. Prof. Xiao, watching from General Trias. So, sige. Pupunta na tayo sa ating paksa ngayong araw na ito. Pero bago ang lahat, siyempre, kumuha muna tayo ng paalala mula sa ating mga, siyempre, sponsor, Vibal Group.
Bertong Kunat! Daryong Dagol! Ano tong balitang pinagkakalat mo dito sa baluarte ko, ha?
Anong balita?
Huwag ka na magmaang-maangan pa!
Ayun ba? Ha? Hindi ba totoo naman? Nasabi ang Lunes sa COVID. Alam mo ba kung nasaan naman kang mayaw? Nasaan naga talaga yun? At higit sa lahat, fake news talaga yung ads sa Revolution.
Ungas ka ba? Ano ba pinagsasabi mo? Saan mo pinagkukuha yan?
Siyempre, nag-research ako, no? Sa Tuktok University. Palibasa kasi at ugot ka na at laos, kaya hindi mo alam yun. Ano, ha?
Lord naman! Magpaulan ka naman ng katalinuhan!
Reliable source of information, sari-saring content na isinulat ng mga eksperto, mga librong di kalidad na abot hanggang sa doomsday, tumawag ka lang sa akin. By the way, hindi ako si Lord. Ako si Vibal.
O pre, tingnan mo to. Di ba sabi ko sa'yo totoo ang EDSA Revolution?
Oo nga, no? O tapos ito, wala pala talaga sa Naga ang bulkang mayon.
Sabi ko sa'yo eh. Bertong Kunat!
Daryong Dagol!
Ano tong balitang pinagkakalat mo dito sa baluarte ko, ha?
Anong balita?
Huwag ka na magmaang-maangan pa!
Ayun ba? Ha? Hindi ba totoo naman? Nasabi ang Lunes sa COVID. Alam mo ba kung nasaan naman kang mayaw? Nasaan naga talaga yun? At higit sa lahat, fake news talaga yung ads sa Revolution.
Ungas ka ba? Ano ba pinagsasabi mo? Saan mo pinagkukuha yan?
Siyempre, nag-research ako, no? Sa Tuktok University. Palibasa kasi at ugot ka na at laos, kaya hindi mo alam yun. Ano, ha?
Lord naman! Magpaulan ka naman ng katalinuhan!
Reliable source of information, sari-saring content na isinulat ng mga eksperto, mga librong di kalidad na abot hanggang sa doomsday, tumawag ka lang sa akin. By the way, hindi ako si Lord. Ako si Vibal.
O pre, tingnan mo to. Di ba sabi ko sa'yo totoo ang EDSA Revolution?
Oo nga, no? O tapos ito, wala pala talaga sa Naga ang bulkang mayon.
Sabi ko sa'yo eh.
Babalik po tayo dito sa Kasaysayan Kaysaya. At pumapalo na po ng 70 watchers mga kaibigan. 70 watchers. Marami pong salamat sa inyo sa suporta nyo sa Vibal Group at sa programang ito, Kasaysayan Kaysaya. Ano na ho tayo? From 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, no? On our 4th year, 2004. Mag-4 years tayo sa Agosto. This is our 4th year. Alright, sige po. Ngayon po, papakilala ko na po. Una sa lahat, nagpapasalamat po ako kasi ito po ay galing sa isang event, no? galing sa isang event na naganap nung birthday ng nanay ko. March 21, 2024. Oh. At ito po ay event ng De La Salle University, Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, DLS Research, at ang Department of... Oops! Ano nangyari mga kaibigan? May tumugtog. Sorry po. Hindi pa tayo... Para naman tinapos natin, ano? Wag ganun. No? Di pa tayo tapos. Di pa tayo tapos. Okay. So, De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub o DLS Research, no? Ito po ay yung pagbisita sa De La Salle University ng isang autor, premiadong autor, no? Ng Estados Unidos, isang historiador na nag-aral tungkol sa isang bahagi ng ating kasaysayan. Ito tinatawag na The Rape of Manila o Battle of Manila. Itong suit ko galing sa filibustero shirt, no? At tatawagan ko na ho ngayon, una sa lahat, nagpapasalamat tayo. Ito po ay binigyang pahintulot na maipalabas ko ang aking interview, no? Kay Search Director Fernando A. Santiago Jr. Nagpapasalamat po tayo sa kanya. Kapatid, marami po salamat sa ating colleague. Gayon din, nagpapasalamat din ako sa DLSU Strategic Communication sa pag-allow na maipalabas ko po dito sa ating programang Kasaysayan, Kaysaya. Ang programang ito ng De La Salle University. So, kaya nga po, maraming salamat. Yung unang 5 minuto po ng interview, hindi ko nakuhanan ng video na hindi ko yata napindot ng maayos. At hahabol na lamang yung video doon sa 5th minute. No? Pero, gayon pa man, narito po, ang buong panayam ko sa autor, no? Isang former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Siya po ang author nito, no? Author ng Rampage, no? Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila, no? Which was named one of the best books of 2018 by the editors of Amazon, Kirkus, and Military Times, and was chosen as a finalist for the prestigious Gilder Lehman Prize for Military History by the New York Historical Society. His other works include Target Tokyo, a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist, The War Below, The Attack on the Liberty, which won the Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison Award, and ito pong Black Snow, Curtis LeMay, The Firebombing of Tokyo, and The Road to the Atomic Bomb. Mga kaibigan, atin pong pagpugayan si Ginoong James M. Scott upang talakayin ang kanyang kung paano ba niya naisulat ang aklat na Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila, at kung ano ang implikasyon nito hindi lang sa Pilipinas kundi sa Southeast Asia ang nangyari sa Maynila at kay General Tomoyuki Yamashita at ang showdown nila ni General Douglas MacArthur. Mga kaibigan, Ginoong James M. Scott.
Thank you, Sir Fernie. I would now begin to... I will not grill our guest, okay? This is a friendly conversation because we would like our students here to have an idea how to write such book, which is well-researched, and this is like a lesson for them, a lesson on historiography. But first of all, what started you on becoming a historian? Is there anything that happened to you when you were young that made you interested in history?
Yeah, let me actually start off by thanking everybody here at LaSalle, and of course my dear friend here, Professor Chow. I mean, you guys have a incredibly imaginative and creative and dedicated teacher here. And when I first met Chow a number of years ago, it was here at LaSalle. And of course, folks here at LaSalle welcomed me when I was doing my research. They welcomed me back for different lectures over the years and whatnot. But it's Professor Chow who, his creativity, and if you've taken his course in which he talks about the massacre that happened here during World War II, it's unlike any other educational experience out there. In the way that he dresses up as one of the victims and walks students through that. He does that for us as well. Like I said, you don't find that kind of passion and dedication to history very often, and you guys are very, very fortunate here at LaSalle to have that. So, so please join me in giving a round of applause.
Thank you
for my
so
good
much.
friend here as well. And so, it is always, like I said, it's always so much fun to come back here and visit, and you guys are always so welcoming. So thank you guys very much.
And I would like to tell LaSallians here that I'm not even a graduate of LaSalle. I have no degrees from LaSalle. But if you read history enough of any institution, of any place, you will become part of it. You will feel that you are part of it. So yeah, there you go.
You're a national treasure. So yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So history, you know, I love history because it is something that has, you know, it's always kind of captured my interest. Although, unfortunately, in college, I had a teacher who told me and said, whatever you do, do not major in the thing that you love. It will only ruin it for you. So that diverted me to becoming an English major, which ended up being a very valuable skill to have because you have to be able to write. Of course, but soon enough, you know, within a few years after graduating, I found myself back in the realm of history, and subsequently had to go back to school, of course, get my master's and everything else for history. But history, but specifically my history in World War II came from my first job after college, and I was a public school teacher in Japan. And so the Japanese government has a program called the JET program, in which they bring over about 2,400 Americans, Brits, Australians, you know, English speakers to teach in the public schools. And so I did that, my first job. And this was back in the 90s. And there were still, of course, a lot of Japanese veterans, a lot of civilians who'd lived through the firebombing and things of that nature that were there. I volunteered to teach. I lived in a little town of about 19,000 students. And I volunteered to teach at the community center. And it was a conversational class. And I had about 8 or 10 students, and frequently the conversations drifted back to the war. And of course, you know, and we got into, I remember I had, you know, for Black Snow, my book on the firebombing, I had folks in my class who talked about what it was like being in Osaka when the city burned and things like that. It really ignited my interest. But what really kind of solidified it is I made a trip with some friends down to Hiroshima. And so I spent a weekend there. I saw the museum, I saw Gambako Dome. And then about 2 weeks later, my parents were going to be in Hawaii. And so it was my spring break, so I flew there to meet them. And I visited Pearl Harbor. And so literally in the span of 2 weeks, I saw the bookends of America's experience in World War II in the Pacific. And something just clicked. And it just lit a fire in me. I started reading everything I could get my hands on about the Pacific War and whatnot. I ended up becoming a journalist because I wanted to, you know, I needed to make a living at that point.
Right,
and so I ended up writing and becoming a journalist. And I ended up kind of covering more of America's more recent conflicts. I was in Iraq a couple of times, Afghanistan. I was a foreign correspondent in Argentina. But eventually I kind of, after about 6 years of that, I gravitated back to writing history books. And so, but the seed for my interest in, particularly in World War II in the Pacific, really began when I was, you know, not much older than you guys. Probably, you know, I was 22, 23 years old when I really started it. And it's now, I'll be 49 next month. So it's been you know, going on 3 decades of this.
So you've written books on the World War II.
Yeah.
But when did you start to become interested in what happened here in Manila?
Yeah, so of course, you know, the Philippines is woven throughout so much of World War II. You can't really escape the experience of the Philippines, particularly with the Americans, its colonial time periods here and everything like that. But you know, for Rampage, one of the things that really surprised me is I was doing some research on the war crimes trials of Hideki Tojo, and you know, it kept coming up about Yamashita because his, of course, was the first trial, and so I started kind of digging into the Yamashita trial and looking at what happened here in Manila. And then, of course, I did a survey of the secondary literature of what had been done on the Battle of Manila, and was pretty stunned to find that in the United States, now there have been some great books on the Battle of Manila by Filipino historians, but in the United States, there had never been a book done by an American historian looking at this pivotal battle in the Pacific. You know, we have many books on Midway. We have many books, for example, on the atomic bomb, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, things like that. But here you have this, you know, this the only urban battle in the Pacific, in which the civilians bear the brunt of it. 100 Filipino civilians killed for every 1 U.S. soldier.
Wow.
And yet it had just fallen through the cracks of scholarship. And so I was like, how is this possible? And so my editor in New York at W.W. Norton, his father was a Bataan Death March survivor. And so he wrote his own book about his father. So I went to John Glusman's his name, and said, John, I really want to do this book on the Battle of Manila. And even John didn't know much about it. And he'd been here in the Philippines doing it all, and he knew a little bit about it. And he was very encouraging and said, you need to jump on that. And so that started this process about a decade ago, looking at what happened here in the Philippines.
If you're going to look at a book, because there are many books already in the Philippines and in other countries about the Battle for Manila. There were Spanish books about the Battle of Manila. Of course, in the Philippines, a lot of them. But if you're going to look at it, your book, Rampage, is comparable, I think, in the international scene to The Rape of Nanking, the book by
Irish
Chang, yes, Irish Chang.
That's high praise. Thank you.
That's a very famous book on the Nanking massacre, and it's like, yes, there are many books that tackled the Battle for Manila, but yours was the one that put it again in the international light, because a lot of the sources were probably 40, 50, 60 years old. So, but let's now go to how you research this, the meat of the. If you're going to look at the back part, where historians, we have a very bad habit of starting our reading with the back part. The notes are terribly detailed.
And we're very judgmental.
Yeah, very judgmental.
When it comes to looking at how people have done their research.
And even here, you have archives and libraries. The ones are listed. These are so many. I don't know where you get your how do you get funding for such an endeavor? You have to go to a lot of places.
Yes. Yeah, it helps that my wife has a good job.
There you go. You find the wife with a good job.
I'll be honest, early in my career, I had a buddy of mine who's this really talented, Pulitzer Prize winning photographer, newspaper journalist, and I was about 22, 23 at the time. He said, whatever you do, just marry a lawyer. You'll always have health insurance. Your insurance, your mortgage will always be paid. And so literally a few years later, just by coincidence, I met my wife, and of course she turned out, she's a lawyer. And when Jim Sirtakis came to my wedding, he said, I'm glad to see you took my advice.
Yeah.
But no, so the research is a very important part of it, and I think we're really lucky that you talk about Iris Chang's book on the rape of Nanking, and she didn't have the textual archival research for her story. So if you go back and you look at the rape of Nanking, a lot of it is sort of passed down, it's oral history. There's not as much of the textual records and the documentation, and there's a reason for that, because MacArthur during the Battle of Manila, on February 17th, 1945, when the first accounts of the atrocities are starting to come in, his troops are running across these scenes and whatnot, he sends out an order. He says, I want all atrocities investigated.
Wow.
And his command took that very literally. So as soon as the Battle of Manila ends, right, it's 29 days, it ends at the beginning of March, the Americans realize that they are not looking at a battlefield, they are looking at a crime scene. And much like those TV shows, NCIS and all that you see, they applied that forensic accounting to what happened here in Manila. And so for the next 6 months, all these Army personnel fanned out and they did massive amounts of investigations. They interviewed atrocity survivors. Many of them were interviewed in hospitals, or a lot of these were field clinics, because the hospitals were all, many of them were destroyed. They took detailed statements. They had to use translators, multiple different languages, Spanish, Tagalog. They even had to have German and whatnot. There were German survivors of the atrocities as well. They took photographs of where these places, these atrocities occurred. They drew maps. They created, literally just bankers' boxes and bankers' boxes of these accounts. And so when I started researching it, I go up to the National Archives, where all these are kept in Washington, D.C. And I would get these records. And I use a digital camera. I take photographs of documents, and that allows me to, instead of using the old days when we had to use photocopiers, remember how slow and time-consuming and costly that was. Now I can use a digital camera, and I can shoot 4,000 pages a day, okay? And I digitized about 65,000 pages of survivor accounts, trial transcripts, documents, evidence.
Photocopies used to be expensive.
Yeah, 25 cents a copy. Yeah.
Especially in archives, they're much more expensive.
Yeah, because that's how they make their money.
Yes.
You know, and so and now they charge photo fees. Like if you're bringing in a camera, it's like $20 a day a lot of times. But hey, I'll pay that any day. You know,
Yes.
but so I digitized that, and that created sort of the bulk of all these accounts. And these were like, I mean, going back in time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks after the battle, somebody recounting what it was like. And I donated a copy of all my digital records are at the Filipinas Heritage Library. So if anybody wants
Ayala.
at Ayala, if anybody's interested in wanting to do research in that, they have digital copies of all my research records that went into Rampage.
Wow, wow. Now, this is a delicate question because I also did research and I did the paper in Filipino and I also read the Yamashita trial,
Yeah.
and I zeroed in on people in the hospitals, what happened to people in the medical institutions during the Battle for Manila. And of course, I also did research on martial law atrocities in the Philippines during the time of the Marcos dictatorship. And in many ways, the research kind of affects you, reading all these things and the massive amount of brutality that you can take. It's just too much. And of course, in the context of what ultimately happened to Irish, because after she worked on Rape of Nanking, she was supposed to be already interested in doing work on the Battle of Manila, which actually you continued in a way, but she killed herself because of depression. So so it's important. We are all historians here, and definitely we might be doing on conflict. Is there anything that you do, perhaps, to keep yourself, in a way, direct question, is there anything that you do to keep yourself sane in doing all this conflict research?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I'll tell you, the sort of the Irish Chang and her story. She's an amazing historian, a young woman with so much talent, so much promise. Stephen Ambrose, in fact, blurbed her book on the Rape of Nanking. She was working on a book here in the Philippines, and as Shal noted, she committed suicide. And that, I think, that loss still echoes through our community of historians even today. And I'll tell you, I didn't realize just how bad the Battle of Manila was until I really started getting into reading the accounts. And I'll tell you, it is, these accounts are so raw, they're so visceral, they're so detailed. In fact, I brought one with us that, when we talk about the massacre here at LaSalle, I actually will read a little bit from one of the accounts of one of the survivors, because because of the nature of these accounts this isn't somebody 70 or 80 years later reflecting back. I mean, this is somebody laying in their hospital bed talking about it. And it does weigh on me. I mean, I had nightmares when I was working on it. I had to read all these accounts over and over again. My kids were little at the time, and they would come home from school, and at the end of the day, I'd greet them back door. I was like, guys, Dad just needs a hug. And they were looking at me and they were going, Dad, you're just so weird. And it weighs on you. And a lot of my books, I ended up doing a book on the Firebombing of Tokyo, which I interviewed, a dozen survivors that I'm working on a book now about the 3 days between Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The sort of the political, what's going on in the United States, Japan, what's going on operationally with in the ground, in the cockpit. And even my editor asked me and said, you really gravitate toward these dark topics. And he's like, look, I'm a Bataan Death March survivor. Like, I come by it honestly, but like, you seem like a happy guy. Like, what's up with that?
That's what I noted too. You have quite a jolly disposition for such
it's just
research.
So I just, you do eventually, I guess, learn to compartmentalize, but it certainly affects me. It absolutely does.
Like, do you go to beach after or something like that?
I do a lot of running. I'm a big jogger.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm a big jogger. I do a lot of running, and I'll tell you, and I'll be honest. There are interviews I walk out of where I'm crying. It affects me tremendously. I was doing an interview with a firebombing survivor a few years ago for Black Snow, and she was orphaned by the American raid. She was one of the people that the Japanese took kids between the ages of 3rd grade and 6th grade out of the city and put them in temples and inns and things like that to protect them. Of course, she was outside when the city was burned. Of course, lost her siblings, lost her parents. She brought the last letter that she had received from her sister to our interview, in which her sister was talking about how beautiful the American bombings were. I mean, I walked out there. There wasn't a dry eye in that room afterwards, and so it does have it takes an emotional toll. So.
We'll now go to the libraries and archives that you went to when you researched for this project, because this might be a tip for some of those who would like to also pursue World War II topics, because I think the material is just so vast that even if a lot of people had used them, you can still see things there. So what was your favorite among all these archives? What would have been the must go to when you do research such as this?
Yeah, I've been really lucky. I mean, I've been to archives all over the world, and I'm a total nerd, so I love doing archival research. I mean, as you know, it's the historical scavenger hunt.
Right, that's right.
You put a book is like a jigsaw puzzle that you put together piece by piece, fact by fact, and you go to the archives to get those facts, and then you do the interviews and the oral histories, and then you meld it all together. But I did a lot of research here in the Philippines for Rampage. I came over here, I did interviews with Battle of Manila survivors. I did a lot of archival research, and I'll tell you, one of the most haunting things I did was come here to LaSalle. And I will tell you, and I was telling our guests when we were on the way over here today, that, there were atrocities that took place all over Manila. I mean, from, here at LaSalle to the Bayview Hotel, which is still right there on, on Rojas Boulevard,
right,
across from the U.S. Embassy. It took place everywhere. But here at LaSalle, the chapel looks exactly the same. And so when I came here and was doing my research, you're trying to sort of cross these decades and connect with the event you're writing about. And I was sitting in the chapel, and I was just sitting in the pews there and just kind of taking it in. And I was looking down at the tile floor, and it kind of clicked in my head. I was like, I've seen this before. And I pulled out my laptop. I carry all my files digitally and external drives. Pulled up the crime scene photos afterwards, and was looking at the chapel and was stunned at how much of it was the exact same.
Right.
The tile floors were the same. The pews that we talked about were the same. And it was really just, because so much in history, it is archival. But the chapel here is a primary source. We're so used to thinking about primary sources as being a transcript, a memo, a cable, a telegram. But places are primary sources as well. And for me, LaSalle was one of the most haunting ones. And that is, of all the atrocity sites in Manila, that's why we come back here over and over and over again. And I will say, it's really lovely when we come back and there's so many young people here too, because it's a positive reinforcement of the future after the tragedy that we so often talk about that happened here.
The material on the Battle of Manila and all of these things that you researched is just massive. How do you select? What's your primary consideration in selecting what to put in a book? Well, your book is already thick, but I can imagine the research is more than this, definitely.
Yeah, and that's always a challenge. Publishers these days want a book that's about 100,000 words. That's a 300-page book, and Rampage was about double that. I've never been real good with deadlines and or deadline links, but increasingly New York publishers want them at those links because it affects the price of the book. It affects people's attention spans are shorter these days. Now, history, people will read longer books, but the publishing demands are still kind of the same. So it is just as important what you leave out as what you include, because you are shaping that. The biggest challenge for me was what happened in Manila was so violent and so gruesome, and then as a historian, you want to include it all.
Right.
And I had so much material that the first draft of the book had all of it in there. I mean, every single major atrocity in Manila, I walked the readers through it. And because the documentation is so extensive, you can recreate these atrocities so the reader can see it unfold. And so the first draft had all that in there. My editor called me up and said, it's just so bloody. He said, we're gonna have to, for readability, we're gonna need to maybe paraphrase. And some of it's repetitive. And so things that are repetitive, maybe paraphrase and whatnot. So we did. We cut out a couple chapters of some of the atrocities, and then afterwards, I read another draft. and thought, well, maybe we probably need to cut another chapter, maybe a chapter and a half out of it, because there's that 75 pages in the middle of the book that are just pretty gruesome. At that point, my editor balked, and he said, "No." He said, "The Battle of Manila is overwhelming. The reader needs to feel overwhelmed." And so I'll say, look, I do think we probably could have cut a little bit more. I think, some folks on our tour have said how bloody it is. I remember when I came back over here for my book tour a number of years ago, we were together then. I had people coming up to me saying it's not bloody enough. It was worse than this. You know, it was you know, and so maybe we got the right balance.
Right,
You know,
right, that's true. Before we go to Yamashita, because we're sponsored, of course, by the DLSU,
Yeah.
Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, and all of that. But I would like to ask, because, and this is from Dr. Fernie Santiago, what are the challenges to historical research on World War II? For example, your view on digital technology and AI in historical research. Does it have any place in historical research?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I'll be honest, I'm late to the game on that because I'm old school, right?
Right,
And,
we are old school.
I used to think that I was advanced because I used a digital camera. And Robert Caro, who's this very famous American historian who writes a lot about Lyndon Johnson, who was one of our presidents, he still goes to the archives and does it by hand with note cards. And I'm sure, like when you were going through school, we were taught, about how you take notes on note cards. And so I'm like, well, I'm way more advanced than him. I'm not using note cards. I'm using a digital camera. Well, last year I was at the Reagan Library, and all these young researchers were there, and they had like iPads, and they had these like tripods that connected, and they were taking pictures. It was going straight into like Dropbox folders, and I was like, man, like I'm now the dinosaur. Like I've got my banged up old digital camera and my tripod from Amazon.com. Like I'm now like, but it is, the technology's moving so quickly, and I've been slow to embrace it. And I do think AI. Look, nothing is going to replace going to an archive and doing research. Period. You've got to go out there and find the documents, talk to the people, walk the battlefields, walk the places, and do it yourself. There's no shortcut to doing it right. And while I do think AI is going to have a place in writing press releases and things for marketing, for what we do, there's not. And I'll tell you, nothing beats going to the archives by yourself. Because invariably you go there. I've had more experiences where I went there thinking I was going to look at this, and because here I am talking to this veteran archivist who's been here for 30 years, and he said, have you thought about this collection? Because this is related to what you're working on. And a perfect example of that about Yamashita.
Yeah.
So I'm at the Army Archives up at in Carlisle, right? And I go there and I'm looking specifically at a handful of documents, and the archivist says, we happen to have one of the guys who sat in judgment of the Yamashita. We have some of his personal papers, and they're not even in the catalog. We haven't put them in there yet. And he wrote some letters about what he thought about that trial. Well, do you think that would be relevant? And I was like, of course. And he talks about like how they voted, like the fact that they made a pact that they would never speak publicly about this trial again, that they felt like the evidence against Yamashita should stand on its own, that they didn't need to sway it. This was brand new material that nobody had ever seen. Now, had I hired somebody to go in there and do it for me, would they have found that? Of course not. You got to go do it yourself. So, and that's also the fun of it. It gets you out of the house, out of the office. So.
Yeah, because some of us, when we don't have time, we use researchers, right?
Yeah.
But there's nothing like you have to go there.
And there are times for that. Look, if I just need a handful of letters from one collection that's in California and I'm on the East Coast, like I'm not going to spend $3,000 to fly out there and rent a hotel, rent a car, and do that. But if it's somewhere that's an important archive and you kind of can judge, you need to go in person.
Okay. Now, I just have a number of questions before we get the questions from the audience. So you have a chance to ask Mr. James Scott himself. In choosing the title for this book, you singled out Yamashita.
Yeah.
There's so many things that can be the title of this book. Is it a marketing strategy or something like that? Because again, Yamashita is like
You're
American.
very wise.
But what are the implications of his trial in Manila to the whole of the war in Southeast Asia? I'm actually curious about, did they even try him for what happened in Singapore or Malaya?
You kind of have two questions there, I think. The first one, going back to how we came up with the title. And number one, I did not come up with the title.
Oh, you did?
No. Okay,
Oh.
so titling a book is an art form, and there are in the publishing companies, their marketing people play a huge role in it, and so I had come up like with a number of different titles, and my editor didn't love any of them. In fact, he told me, he said, James, I want you to spend the weekend, I want you to reread the manuscript, go back and look for quotes used in the book that might have might make a good, like a little title or whatnot.
I'm now curious what are the other titles that would have been titles of the book.
And I'll tell you, the one I really liked was there's a quote from one of the letters. I somebody surveying Manila right afterwards, and it was like all these ruins. And my editor wanted something kind of like poetic, and so I was like, I like that, like all these ruins. And he wrote me back and said, I'm still not loving it. Keep thinking about it. And like I literally put together 2 pages of this. And then it's like a Friday night, and I'm at home, and I'm outside in the backyard. I've got the little grill going. I've got some burgers on there, and a glass of wine, and my cell phone rings. It's my editor, and he's up in New York, and he's doing the exact same thing. And he goes, I've got it. He's like, the book's called Rampage. He's like, that's what happened in Manila. And I was like, that's perfect. And so he came up with the title. Now, I will tell you, the subtitle, that is where we have to get in all the metadata that needs to be for Google searchers, okay? You have to have, subtitles are so important because that's where you get all the things. It's gotta be about World War II, you gotta have a reference there. MacArthur's a big name, Yamashita is a big name, you gotta have all those names in there. And that just becomes the big shoehorn everything in there that's gonna pop up in a Google search. And that's the truth of it.
Yeah, really amazing. How many print runs did you have in the first edition?
I think the first issue is probably about 20,000, 25,000, something like that.
And of course, everything sold out, and there's another edition.
I'm not even sure what, it went through a few hardcover printings, and then of course the paperbacks, and it's been through multiple paperback printings. So it, and of course the beauty with technology nowadays is that they can print. It's all print on demand for paperbacks. So the book will stay in print forever because if you want 1 copy or you want 100 copies, they can literally just punch them out and send them to you. So it's, yeah.
Of course, the struggle with Filipino historians is that we don't have print runs like that,
Yeah.
It's just 500 copies and, it's even difficult to sell. So that's the problem, that's the difference. That's why historians can actually make a living just by writing something like this. And the Filipino historians are struggling.
Yeah.
And
don't forget the wife is a lawyer. You got to remember.
Definitely. Yeah. But we're making waves already. We're beginning to make waves actually internationally because there's some young writers. One of them, my student, who's one of the New York Times bestseller.
Really?
Yeah. Thea Guanzon, one of fantasy, Hurricane Wars. Yeah, she was my student in UP.
And if we were smart, we'd be writing that kind of stuff too.
Exactly.
I know.
Exactly. Exactly.
Why do we have to love history?
Right. But history is important. Anyway, so I will now. My next question. I forgot my next question. There you go. So yeah, how about Southeast Asia and Yamashita?
Yeah. So actually, everything he was tried for is what happened for here. Okay, and the generally agreed upon number, if you go to the Philippines government website, is about 100,000 people killed here. That is what the U.S. Army historians put the number at in the 1940s as well. Yamashita was actually tried only for about 62,000 counts. And I say only
Right.
That was what they put him on trial for, about 62,000 counts of murder, all of which largely took place here in Manila. They did throw in some of the massacres some of those accounts were things that happened in Batangas and outside of Manila, but much of it was what happened here in Manila. There was a huge rush because you have to remember the battle ends in March 3rd, 1945. He surrenders in September of 45. He goes on trial that fall. So the time from when the battle occurs until he goes on trial is less than a year. And of course, at that point, they're still tabulating all the different things that happened here and still accounting for it. So, and even the prosecutor said that, look, we're not here to prosecute him for every single crime that happened in the Philippines. We're here just to prosecute him for as much as we can, the bulk of it, and move on. Of course, presenting a case with 62,000 murders, a lot of it was just getting it on record that this happened. I mean, to walk a jury, or in this case, a panel of judges through it could have taken years. And so a lot of it was just really an effort to sort of get these things on the records and move on. None of what happened earlier in Yamashita's career was part of that. Of course, he was considered the architect for the Suching massacre that took place down in Singapore and Malaysia.
Right.
Of course, other types of atrocities. I mean, this type of violence followed the Imperial Japanese Army throughout Southeast Asia. In fact, the day when he was put on trial, the United States got a message from Australia saying, look, if for any reason you don't convict him, hand him over, we'll take it from there. So there was, they were waiting in the wings, I think, for their own war crimes trials afterwards.
Wow. So there you go.
Yeah.
And of course, we all know that Yamashita is supposed to be, he left Manila and asked all the Japanese forces to actually retreat.
Yeah.
So if they followed them, there should have been not so much atrocities that happened.
Yeah, and I've never, Yamashita always said, look, what happened in Manila, it was all fell to Rear Admiral Sanji Obuchi, who commanded a much smaller detachment. It was the Manila Naval Defense Forces, less than 20,000 troops here. And it was really all their fault, and so, but of course, he died. He committed suicide in the agricultural building, which is, just really not but a couple miles from here. He made a really great scapegoat. And I think one of the points that the prosecution made is if this was really a case of one guy going haywire, then yes, okay, then Manila makes sense. But the United States determined that there were 27 major atrocities just in Manila. There were 275 sets of atrocities, major atrocities that took place outside of Manila. And Yamashita was the commanding general for all Japanese forces in the Philippines. So that argument really, the prosecution didn't really buy that argument, because you're like, if you're really this great commander who would force your troops not to commit these, how do you explain the other 275 atrocities? And
Right.
what happened in some of the provinces is just as bad. It's equally as horrific as what happened here in Manila.
Because there's a documentary that was shown, right, that says that they intercepted the letter, and supposedly it was an order from Tokyo. It was all the civilians that would be captured would be executed. There's confusion there, because supposedly Yamashita said that we should go. They should go, but there's a order from Tokyo that
and the order from Tokyo was kind of a propaganda piece.
Is that a
at
fake?
point. Yeah, it was a fake.
Oh,
And it was introduced.
there you go.
It was introduced back in 1945, and it wasn't legit. Don't get me wrong. We had plenty of orders from Japanese commanders about how best to kill civilians, and that was one of the things too, because one of the arguments was these were just troops who went haywire. And then, of course, a lot of Japanese documentation was found after the battle here in Manila. We translated it all, and these orders gave very specific instructions for how best to save ammunition and massacre lots of people. And one of the things that said, like, if you're going to be massacring people, it's best to just lock them in buildings and set them on fire. Well, we have plenty of examples right here.
That's
you have
true.
the German club is a perfect example. 500 people trapped inside of a building that's set on fire. What happened at St. Paul's College?
Conspicio de San Jose.
Yeah, exactly. So this type of stuff, happened throughout. And so you can see, so we have the battlefield orders that show that this wasn't a handful of troops that went crazy. This was ordered by superior officers on how to commit these crimes.
Wow. Okay, I would like to read a comment from the former Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary of the Philippines and now the Ambassador to the Court of St. James, Teodoro Locsin Jr., my friend, on your book.
Yeah.
He said, I finished your book on the plane. Towards the end, it swings to the other way to the injustice of hanging Yamashita, citing great authorities, and then restore the balance with your elegy to the dead, never to rise again, Manila. Near tears. So beautiful.
Thank you.
No foreigner today more deserves the highest civilian award for service to the Filipino people. You, sir, gave us back the huge defining chunk of the national memory that our fathers chose to bury their face. No wonder our old people never talked but for a few, and no one listened. You explained the most baffling aspect of our relationship with our fathers, their silence, their seething and often misdirected anger, their willingness to go when the time came to say goodbye or riddance to this life. It is literature as fine as its prose as Macaulay's, but with more wisdom and more modern relevance in its content. For always there is the threat of Oriental despotism can only act as it did in Manila. And of course we saw that.
I'm very, very, very honored by those comments.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, so before I get questions, your latest book, Black Snow, the Japanese were the perpetrators and the Filipinos were the victims. It seems that here, the Japanese are the victims of America, and you're an American yourself. And it says in the marketing of the book that, that this is your most important work to date. So, wow.
I didn't write that, so.
Yeah, so do you think this is the case? And why tackle the firebombing of Tokyo? And what were the similarities and differences of that story and that of Manila?
Marketing is always about selling the latest product. So, that's
And
why
we
that one has
need
to
it.
be. That one has to be the best.
We need to
So-
learn it actually. Historians should need to learn how to market, of course, truthfully.
Yes, truthfully.
Truthfully.
But you have to be your biggest self-advocate, because no one else is going to advocate
That's
for
true.
you.
That's
so
true.
you really
Yeah.
have to do
That's
that.
true.
So no, I mean, I ran across this story initially when I was working on a previous war in the Pacific, and I was actually writing
The War Below.
Yep, and I was writing about those guys in prison camps in Tokyo who witnessed that firebombing, and so it ended up being about 2 or 3 pages in that book, and I thought at the time, wow, this is a fascinating story. I really need to come back to this because it's a story, you know, not just of the bombing, it's the story of the development of the B-29, it's a story of aviation, it's a story of changing strategies of American air power. And then it just, you know, I have a kind of a list of stories, and it was on there. It just kind of, the Doolittle book came first, then Rampage, and then I finally finished up, and I was like, you know, I'd like to go back and sort of tackle that story, and you know, and I really enjoyed working on it. I had terrific cooperation, not only from B-29 crew members who flew those missions and their families, but also from Japanese survivors of the firebombing. I went, spent several weeks in Tokyo. I did interviews with them, you know, in order to tell that story. And I'm actually now kind of working. I think Target Tokyo looks at the first raid on Japan in April 1942. Black Snow kind of picks it up with the next thing, and then the book I'm working on now, looking at the rise to the atomic bombing, is really kind of it's sort of the whole story of the Army Air Force's war.
And quite important now because of Oppenheimer.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to ride that wave.
Yeah, exactly. Marketing, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of interest now. I got my editors, he constantly texts me like, are you done yet? Hurry up, man, we got to get this out.
So what were the similarities of that? There were civilians. I mean, it was fire, and
Yeah.
were less people who died? I don't know.
No, gosh, about 105,000 people died
Oh my
in the
goodness.
firebombing of Tokyo. And it's a completely forgotten story, too.
Yes,
It's one of those
exactly.
where, you know, everybody knows Hiroshima,
Yes.
you know, Nagasaki kind of gets sort of overshadowed as well. Even if you go to Japan, you go to Hiroshima, there's this amazing museum there where Japan has invested all of its energy and its national memory of World War II there. And then you go to Tokyo, and for years and years and years, there's absolutely nothing.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it really fell to this one Japanese historian who just passed away a couple of years ago, Katsumoto Satome, and he was a survivor of it. He wrote a book on it in the 1970s, and he raised money privately to open this small private museum in Tokyo. And actually, when I was working on the book, they turned over their conference room to me on the 3rd floor there for an entire week to let me use it for interviews. And they have a lot of the artifacts there from the firebombing. I mean, they have old incendiary casings, they've got coins that had fused together and things like that. But I was really surprised because you don't get to Hiroshima without first going through Tokyo. And
Right.
the reason being is that this was an evolution in American warfighting strategy, which was up until Tokyo, American tactics have always been daylight, high altitude bombing, and it was about military targets. And with the firebombing of Tokyo, it's a switch. It goes from not only tactically from high altitude daylight to low altitude nighttime, but you're switching out conventional normal demolition bombs for napalm filled
My
incinerators.
God.
And you're burning cities. And it's the first time that America essentially puts the bullseye on the backs of civilians. And that's a huge moral turning point for the United States. And so when LeMay flew that mission, there was a lot of concern. How is the American public going to handle this? And so actually, when you go through the documentation in the National Archives, they're monitoring what are the editorial pages saying about this. You know, are lawmakers going on, you know, the Senate or the House floor and giving speeches against doing this kind of stuff? I mean, what's the backlash going to be to this?
Right.
And they're stunned that the backlash there is none. And yet it's actually all positive. And I think what really summarized it was Time magazine came out with an article and they said, properly kindled, Japanese cities will burn like the autumn leaves. And Kurt LeMay, who's the commander at that point, he's 38 years old and he's in charge of this amazingly powerful American force. He says, green light. And they
Wow.
begin burning Japanese cities night after night after night. Literally the last 150 days of the war, they will burn 64 Japanese cities, over 170 square miles of Japanese.
My God.
56 square miles of Tokyo will be burned in 6 different missions. Put that in perspective, Manhattan Island, 21 square miles. And so you don't get to Oppenheimer and the atomic bomb without
Oh my God.
that going through Tokyo and making sure the American public are
There's a
aware.
perception that the Japanese, burned a lot of our cities, and because this is not told, we thought that just Tokyo was just Hiroshima, just Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It really also, what happened to the Philippines is also what happened in Japan.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, so the Americans were running out of cities. And so, I mean, we burned all, I mean, Japan had much of its industry in a handful of big cities, and so we burned all those by June. We moved on to secondary sized cities, and we were down to tertiary sized cities, literally cities of a population of about 35,000. The only reason Hiroshima existed as a target was because LeMay had previously been ordered to hold back a handful of cities so that they could test the atomic bomb on them and have a sense of like what kind of destruction it would have. Otherwise, Hiroshima would have been burned way, back in June, July. So yeah, he was ordered to hold back a handful.
And I think Curtis LeMay, I remembered in the book when I was reading it, he said that if we didn't win the war, we would have been the war criminals.
Exactly. You know who made that comment too? Robert McNamara.
Yeah. Okay. Let's. If you have questions now, especially our students.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Please, Lyro.
All right. So you did mention. Should I use this?
Yes, please. For the documentation. Thank you.
All right. So you did mention that the superior officers ordered how to kill civilians inside the building. So my question is, who ordered those superior officers, and what motivates that order?
Yeah. So those orders came from Iwabuchi. And so they came from the Manila Naval Defense Force, okay? Because you have to remember, at this point of the war, Yamashita's not here. He's up in Baguio. And so he is monitoring radio communications. So Yamashita later argued, hey, I didn't really know what was going on in Manila and whatnot. A lot of the Americans didn't really put a lot of faith in that because some of Yamashita's own aides said, well, we were listening to everything that was going on over the radios. And we were in communication at that point. And so we don't know, because nobody was transcribing things that were said over airwaves, so we have no idea what was said on any of the radio communication. That's just a big gap. We don't know now as historians, they didn't know now then as prosecutors. All we have are the written papers, and all of those came from Iwabuchi's command. So, because he was the only command unit here in Manila at that time.
Okay. Yes, sir. Before,
Yeah.
Sir Ivan. No, you, please. Mr. Imperial, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'm Earl Imperial. It's like interesting in World War II history for personal hobby reasons.
Hold the mic to you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Earl Imperial. World War II history is a personal hobby for personal reasons. There is one thing that I would like to ask, especially on the topic of Battle of Manila. It's the prelude of it. Why did they choose to land in the Philippines instead of other places?
Good question. Yeah, good question.
Especially because from what I remember is that most of the reason why the US went to the Philippines is because of General MacArthur's backing. Are there those who chose not to back MacArthur and chose another target, and for what reasons?
Yeah. Awesome, another great question. Yeah, so that really gets at the fundamental debate over where America was going to go. Was it going to be the Philippines or was it going to be Formosa? And of course, that fight gets settled in July of 1944 at a beachfront mansion in Hawaii, where MacArthur is summoned along with Chester Nimitz, who's of course commander of the Pacific Fleet, and FDR is out there.
Yeah.
And of course, Admiral King, who was chief of naval operations and was really the leader of the Navy, really wanted to go to Formosa. And they wanted to just cut off the Philippines, go up farther north, and then just kind of, in the words of what a lot of the staff used at that time, let the Philippines or let the Japanese here wither on the vine, as they would say. But MacArthur, of course, obviously disagreed with that. He had famously vowed, I shall return, and for him, it was very much a personal thing. Now, MacArthur would later say that when he gets summoned to Hawaii, that he's completely caught off guard about what this conference is all about, and that he has no idea and he's not prepared. And Nimitz shows up and he's got, mats and binders and a big pointing stick, and that they're ready to make this argument. And that's just not true. And we know that because MacArthur's pilot was a really good diary writer. And flying from Australia all the way over to Hawaii is a really long flight in a propped plane. And so MacArthur didn't sleep that whole time. And so he was in the back and he was pacing. And he liked to pace. And he would rehearse his argument. And at times, actually, his pilot was a guy by the name of Dusty Rhodes. He would sit with Dusty and be like, Dusty, how do you think of this argument? Da, da, da. He would go over it with him. Of course, Dusty's like, that night, he's like, right? All down here. And so we know that MacArthur was not totally unprepared. And so when he ggets there, they prepared to pitch their two opposing views. The reality was Nimitz's heart wasn't really in Formosa either. And no, he was there to do the bidding largely of King. And Nimitz saw both sides of it. In fact, King later, chastised him and said, "You didn't fight hard enough." And Admiral King, for folks who aren't that familiar with it, I mean, he was an SOB. I mean, he was a junkyard dog. I mean, he was just a mean sort. Even his own children talked about how mean he was. I mean, and so, in Port Chester, Nimitz is a pretty easygoing guy, and so he takes it. But the argument that MacArthur makes is one that's not so much on tactics and strategy, although that is very much the case. Look, bypassing the Philippines, you would have left Yamashita here. He had 250,000 troops. He had planes. He had kamikazes. He had all this stuff. You're going to leave that in your rear, and that's a really bad thing to do. I mean, because then the Japanese just can come up and they can harass your supply lines and everything else. But he made a bigger argument about the morality of why it was important to come back to the Philippines, and that was because that the Philippines had long been an American colony since the end of the Spanish-American War. MacArthur lived here. A lot of Americans lived here. We had, not only did we have the Filipino population that was suffering under Japanese occupation, we had American troops that were locked up in Cabanatuan and different camps. Santo Tomas here in Manila was filled with 3,700. Los Baños, just south of here. That he said, look, if we bypass that, we are going to be sending the worst message we could ever send to the Filipinos that we don't support you. And I think in part, this is just my personal opinion.
Yeah.
Admiral King, I think he was just doing that to some extent because he was just trying to rub it in on MacArthur, because he knew MacArthur had so much personally invested in I shall return, and that if he could do this, it was just a way to kind of it's like an office politics jab, remember, at that highest level, you had that kind of stuff, and King was that kind of SOB. I mean, he was very disrespectful to Hap Arnold. He wouldn't address him personally because he felt like he was an inferior, and so, I mean, King was that kind of personality.
So you thought that going to the Philippines actually was instrumental in winning the war?
Yeah, I think here's where I think MacArthur went a little sideways. I think had MacArthur not come back to the Philippines, it would have been a humanitarian catastrophe here. Manila was in such bad shape by the time the Americans come back. The societal fabric is completely unraveled. There's the buy-sell trade. I mean, the economy's broken.
Right.
Your currency, they're using the Japanese Mickey Mouse money here. It's got no value, And so what happens is you have a bartering system that arises. And if you go back and you look at the buy-sell trade here, I mean, people were abandoning their children because they couldn't afford to raise them. They were selling their children. They were grave robbing here just to be able to find anything that you could barter or sell. Okay, about 500 people a day are dying of starvation in Manila. Okay, so if we had waited from January and February 1945 to the end of the war, you would have had a humanitarian catastrophe.
Wow.
Many thousands of people would have died. All the American internees would have also died. They were dying about 3 or 4 a day at Santo Tomas. That would have had a huge political problem back in Washington if we'd bypassed and let executives from Ford Motor Company, Studebaker, and all these other companies starve. Their children were here too. So, I mean, they really needed to come back. Where MacArthur didn't need to do is he did not need to spend the whole rest of the war chasing Japanese troops all over rural parts of the Philippines. I mean, particularly the Luzon campaign. He spends the whole rest of the war chasing Yamashita all the way up in northern Luzon. And quite frankly, they could have just left troops and kind of walled them off. We now know, too, that Yamashita, they weren't interested in messing with American operations. His biggest goal up there was unit survival. He was just trying to keep his guys together till the end of the war. And so, MacArthur spends a lot of resources and whatnot that could probably have been used elsewhere, chasing after him.
There you go. Before I call the next guy, I hope that you can, when you are in Manila, you can also attend his tour, because he's the most fantastic tour guide and cultural worker of Binondo, Chinatown, which is very interesting.
Who's
Mr.
that?
Ivan Mandy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not expect that introduction, but thank you. I do tours in Manila, and I'm also particularly interested in World War II. In fact, the first book that I read on the Battle of Manila was when I was in high school. It was written by a local historian, Alfonso Aluit.
Aluit.
Right? That was in 1995, and it was a 50th anniversary. I've read many books on the Battle of Manila since. So my question is, Xiao was talking about the differences between Filipino historians and the challenges of being a Filipino historian versus an American historian, where you have more resources. So how much of this book did you use Japanese sources with? No? So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, once Yamashita's here and the Americans invade, there's nothing else coming in from Japan. Nobody's getting out, nothing else is coming in. The back door to Luzon has effectively been closed. So all the Japanese resources are actually come from the captured documentation that we found and the interviews and interrogations with Yamashita, Muto, and other of his senior survivors. So I did look. Of course, there were a number of monographs and things like that done in the American occupation period of Japan that dealt with this. Of course, I looked at those kind of things. There were, in some of the Japanese media accounts, newspapers, there were reports of things that were received by radio from Yamashita that were published up there, but a lot of that was propaganda. But much of the documentation really came from what was captured here. And it came from those interviews. I mean, you have to remember, Yamashita testified for 15 hours. Granted, you can't always believe what he had to say on everything. And of course, Muto wrote a lot, but there was also all of their interrogations that were done, at New Bilibid Prison. And I'll tell you, and some of the best commentary on that came from the people who were doing the interviews with him, noting the things they left out, the way they phrase things. And one of the things that I really found it was almost like for the Battle of Manila, for example, it said, it's almost like they all knew just enough to know not to want to be associated with Manila. And it was like they knew to be able to say, hey, I know enough about what went on in there, but I had nothing to do with it. And it was kind of like, but the investigators really didn't put a lot of credence in that. And so yeah, but that's a really great question on that. This was fortunately, it was easy. I normally do have to go to Japan. I normally do have to hire translators and research helpers and things like that. But this is one where fortunately a lot of that material was in the United States.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Was your book released in Tokyo, and how are the Japanese? Of course, we all know that the conservative government in Japan really hates this stuff, but the ordinary Japanese or some of the Japanese people, how did they take this? Your works, actually, in general.
Well, the Japanese don't really buy American books for translation in World War II. Our books will come out here, they'll come out in China, they'll come out in Indonesia, of course, Australia. Japanese do not buy. In fact, we thought Black Snow, of all my books, of course, Rampage, there's no way they want to read that. But we thought Black Snow was one that the Japanese might pick up for translation and just crickets. And of course, I have, my literary agent has we have overseas sub-agents that market these things. But the Japanese in general, and it's not just me, I've talked to other World War II historians, they just don't buy American books in translation. They're not interested in the perspective that's coming from overseas. And it's not that they're not interested in history, because the Japanese have a pretty robust publishing industry that is dedicated toward publishing their own accounts of it. I mean, gosh, for the Firebombing of Tokyo, I probably went through 50 different memoirs from Japanese writers. Of course, all these are in Japanese, they're not in translation. They have a 5-volume set of official documents on the Firebombing of Tokyo. It's 5,000 pages of oral histories, aggregated documents from police, fire officials, things like that, of what it was like. It's not that they're ignoring history, they just want to produce it themselves. And that's unfortunate, because I do think we live in an era where you can get on an airplane and I can come over here and do research and interview people and do that and get the Filipino side of the story. I can go to Japan, I can do the same thing, I can get the Japanese side. I mean, and readers nowadays expect to have that 360-degree view
Right.
of what it's like for all the participants, but the Japanese they don't want that.
Did you use AI to translate Japanese sources, or Japanese?
No, gosh, even though I lived in Japan, I can still get to the bathroom, I can order a beer,
There you go.
some okonomiyaki, but no, I use translation apps for initial waves on stuff, because I'll tell you the thing is, you go, and I also know it does help that I've lived in Japan because I have friends over there and research, people have helped me with my research, so I know my way around Japanese language. Like they don't use eBay, they use Yahoo Bids and things like that. So I know how to find older accounts of books and things like that. Because a lot of the books I was using, for example, for firebombing, were books that were done in the 60s and 70s. So they're not in print. You have to find the old artifacts of them. And then, Google Translation is really, really good. And so you can do that, and it'll give you a rough translation of the page. And so I can get a Japanese history book, and I can figure out if it's got 10 chapters, that the first 4 chapters are all about where the war is going on and what the Americans are doing. I don't need those 4 chapters. I can figure out, I just need chapters 5, 6, and 7. I can get a rough translation of it. And then if I'm gonna need to get like specifics, like if they're charts or graphs or things like that, then I know, all right, on this page, and I can send it off to translators to have them do it. Now I work with a couple different types of translators. I work with somebody, if I just need to know the facts on the page, like I don't need a quotable quote, I just need the chart reproduced, it's a little bit cheaper. If I need like fine level translation that like this is an official document, what's it gonna look at? Like you gotta have, and I've worked with this wonderful translator, she was NHK's longtime translator there. So you work with different grades of it. When I'm doing interviews, same thing. I have 2 different translators often in the room with me. I have a translator for me, I have a translator for the Japanese person. That way we're having a running conversation, somebody just kind of whispering in my ear what's going on. Same thing's going on there, so we can have sort of more of a natural dialogue. All of it, of course, is recorded, and then the transcript is produced from it. So it is costly, don't get me wrong, doing that, but it is important. I do think with Black Snow, for example, benefited greatly by having Japanese voices in it. Martin?
Yeah. The U.S., Martin Koenigsberg, I guess on this.
You'll pass it. No technical questions, Martin. It's always.
The U.S. Army Air Corps had been incredibly insulting to Bomber Command for 4 years.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they start running basically Bomber Command missions, because
that's how
Germany was burned, was by Bomber Command. Any recognition of that at all?
Yeah. Good question. Yeah.
Bomber Command's the British.
Yeah. No, I love Martin. Martin will normally be like, talk to me about the size of the rivets on the B-29. He's very, very, very technical.
I read between 60 and 120, read and review between 60 and 121 military history.
I think we need to get Martin. His grasp of the fine detail on this stuff is pretty extraordinary. And that's a really great question. Bomber Command, of course, was the British equivalent of the American Army Air Forces, and of course they had begun burning German cities all the way back to 1942. Of course they do it in response to the Blitz, 57 nights of consecutive bombing of London. Of course then Germany, much like the United States, goes on to begin burning other cities. I think Coventry is probably the most notorious of those attacks, which they burned. Literally, I think about a third of the population was dehoused and or killed or injured in that. It's pretty traumatic. The British begin retaliating, adopt those same tactics, and they then move all the way up. Of course, Dresden, I think, gets a lot of the attention. I think that's in 1945. I think Hamburg is actually probably the far greater attack, and it's kind of like Tokyo. It's sort of overshadowed. 45,000 people are killed in Hamburg. Dresden, the numbers, they've been revised downward over the years, but it's about 25,000 people died in Dresden. And so the Americans initially are very arm's length in wanting to join this. We're very convinced that the high altitude daylight precision bombing is not only is morally superior, but also more effective, and that you're going to knock out enemy aircraft, enemy industry, and things like that. And of course, we completely abandoned all of that in the Pacific. And how that comes about too is because of Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay, of course, is the 38-year-old commander. He had studied the after-action photographs of Hamburg and thought, there's something to this. So then he comes over to the Pacific, and we're flying high-altitude daylight missions, and he tries to make those work for about 6 weeks, and he realizes that the jet streams over Japan, the cloudy weather over Japan and whatnot, it's not going to work, and he's going to have to completely radically rethink how America does it. And at that point, he takes a playbook right out of what Bomber Command does. And it's funny because as LeMay is doing that, is when the British are suddenly realizing that, like, man, we're going to come into occupation of much of Germany, and it's going to all be destroyed. And of course, there's also this moral pushback that's beginning to rise up there. And of course, America's now as the Brits are looking for the off-road, the Americans are looking for the on-ramp, and they go that route. So, but is there any kind of pushback from the British on that? Absolutely not, other than a whole, like, we told you so. That probably came out of that in the aftermath of it. Great question, though. Thank you, Martin.
There we go. Probably last 1 or 2 questions. Yes, sir. Please. Thank you, thank you. No, just. Yeah. We will reach you.
That's very accommodating. I wanted to ask.
Name, sir, please.
My name is Jaime Diaz de Rivera. I'm also really, I mean, I'm an engineer, but I'm also really interested in World War II. I'm also really interested in the rivets on the B-29.
There's 600,000. Just so you know.
Nice to know. I just
God.
wanted to ask, because you know you've written so much about the Pacific Theater and whatnot. I was wondering if during all your research, has there been any striking discoveries you've made whenever you're doing your research? Like any point where you're just like, okay, that's a bit too much. That's like my breaking point at this point.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think you probably have that kind of stuff with all your projects. I mean, I think for the Battle of Manila, I think one of the things that hit me was how much more violent it was than I thought it would be.
Oh.
And I did not realize that until I'd already signed that contract and cashed that first check, that I was now, hook, line, and sinker heading into this. And, I really started getting into the material. And, of course, I knew from secondary literature and whatnot that things were in Manila were bad, but when I started getting in and really reading the accounts and, day after day after day, I mean, it took me 3 months just to read all those depositions. And it was it's pretty gruesome. And so I think that was probably my biggest one for the Battle of Manila. It's just, how much worse it was than even we remember. So great question. Thank you.
Another one? Yes, sir. Maybe you can ask your question and then he can also ask his question.
Yeah.
So it would be a compounded question,
Yeah.
which will make it more difficult for Mr. Scott to
I have a
answer.
short memory.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Simon Palayo. I'm actually a student of PUP, but I do have a very niche interest in history, especially World War II. And my question is that there's some parallels with how the German occupation of France is, you can see it here also with the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, and we can see how the Germans treated Paris, Versailles, and the other chateaus in the Loire Valley. And it's just my question is that why is the Japanese, like, they didn't really have this awareness of, like, Manila was poised as an open city, right, 1941, and I'm just really saddened at the fact that once a great world city, Manila is it, decades or even centuries before London and New York was a world city, there's just 400 years of culture burned at this day. We have the Iglesia de Santo Domingo in Intramuros, the other great churches in Intramuros. I'm just, why is it the Japanese didn't think of like the Philippines as like kind of like a resort or like a cultural destination, like a place where they can escape the horrors of war? Why is it that they have such blatant disregard for international law, like common human decency like that, and also the preservation of culture?
Okay, thank you very much. The other question, I'm taking note of the questions.
I'm Martin Angelo from University of Santo Tomas. I'm actually
We've met before, yes.
Yeah, twice.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm also the what do you call a researcher for our research and presentations team on the History Society. And while researching for our society's post on the Battle of Manila and my own thesis, one statement from Robert Smith's from Crime on the Philippines stuck out to me and kind of relates to his point. So he said, American lives were understandably far more valuable than historic landmarks. Do you think that there is a way the Americans could have done the battle, handled the battle better, or how they handled the battle itself by using artillery and aerial bombardments indiscriminately is the best option they had at the time?
Okay, while Mr. Scott is thinking of the answers,
I would like to emphasize also that the point that Manila, we always say that Manila is the second most destroyed city in the world during World War II, which is not correct, because as was pointed out, the German cities are more destroyed, and some would say we were the second most destroyed Allied city in the world after Warsaw.
But then, of course, all the Japanese cities are destroyed too.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
Tokyo,
probably
yeah.
Warsaw became destroyed because they saw Warsaw. I'm joking, of course. Of course, there is there's also now the magic number 100,000, which is being contested by Peter Parsons, if you know. I think he pegged it on around 40,000, 35,000 to 40,000, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and then of course you have the Memorare, which is the Battle of Manila Survivors Association. They say the number is even higher than 100,000. So
Right.
it's it's one of those challenges you have in like how do you quantify that much destruction, particularly. I mean, in some cases you can, but in cases where entire families were wiped out, and in the tragedy and the chaos after Manila, when the city's it's gutted, it's burned, people leave, they don't ever come back, the remains are never found. It's a really tough thing. That's the beauty of statisticians, is that it falls to them, I think, to be the ones to do it and to try to track that down. But going back to the Japanese occupation, the Japanese occupation, I think, is one of the most fascinating stories here, because you're right, they absolutely mismanaged everything about life in the Philippines. And much like other places in Germany, you had a lot of the Japanese officers came here and they moved into a lot of the nice residences where people, they kicked out the residents, they took over their homes. And there was a great quote from the diary of Felipe Buencamino, who said that what kind of enemy is this that fights a war with nice residences and pianos? One of the first things they did when they came here to the Philippines is they looted Hikok's department store, which was the big department store down there by the Escolta. And so they really kind of came in and just took everything. And it wasn't just nice things, they took food, they took farm equipment, anything, precious metals, that kind of stuff. A lot of it was shipped back to Japan where it could be melted down for the war effort. But it wasn't just Manila where this occurred. This happened all over Southeast Asia. I mean, in China, they did the exact same thing. They went into hospitals, they took the microscopes, they took the medicines. They went so far as to literally pull up railroad lines in metal and ship that back into in order to melt it down. And so it's a tragedy, of course. And then, of course, when the Americans come in, 613 city blocks are destroyed in Manila. And it's important to remember Manila was much smaller then than it is today. 17 million people today live in the greater metro Manila area. Just 17 million people lived in all the Philippines back then. Population of Manila pre-war was about 640,000 people, so it's pretty small. So when you look at that 613 city blocks destroyed, it's a pretty tremendous amount. Literally, 1 out of every 3 people was dehoused here in Manila.
Wow.
And so, as the Americans, General Robert Baitler was asked that question, what about the buildings versus the people and everything? And he basically said, I don't give a damn about buildings, I give a damn about people. And that was the attitude that the American commanders took, was, they were here to get rid of the enemy and to save American lives, and buildings can be rebuilt, lives cannot be replenished, I think was their attitude. The Japanese did not make it easy for them. If you look at how they turned Manila into a booby-trapped filled maze, the way they fortified buildings, the way they fortified intersections, if you go around and you look at all the old pre-war buildings, like the post office, which just burned recently, the Fine Arts Building, which was the legislature back then, they dug wells in the bottoms of them. I mean, these were fortresses, and so the only way you could retake them was literally you pummel them and then send in assault troops, and that's where the flamethrower became such a dominant weapon during the Battle of Manila, because you had all these guys signing up for flamethrower training after they got to Manila. They literally were. I mean, because it was, you see it out on Corregidor, dealing with the tunnels, satchel charges, things like that, and then just bulldozers, just bulldozing over the basements where they were. And so, unfortunately, cultural treasures are always secondary in any combat. You look at it all over Europe, same thing happened there, that happened here. You look at it elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and it's one of the huge tragedies. I do think in the case of Manila, the Battle of Manila had a huge multi-generational effect here. It wasn't just military-aged men who were killed. It was infants and children, middle-aged people, grandparents, and of course all those cultural treasures. It wasn't just the buildings and the architecture. It was the museums, the priceless literary works, the paintings, the sculptures. I mean, all the thousands of patient records at PGH right down the road from here. all the old meteorological data going back to the Jesuits that were here, the old Spanish records. I mean, in a lot of ways, it was a cultural eradication in what happened. And that I think is a big tragedy. It's very pronounced here in Manila, but it did happen elsewhere.
And I think you answered both questions. Did have the Americans did it better, or can the Americans have done it better? And also, that the Japanese would not definitely make this a resort.
Yeah, there was a line in one of the American reports that said we're going to have to exterminate the Japanese in place, and that was because of how well dug in they were.
My God. Okay, the last question you will serve for our director of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, Dr. Fernando Santiago.
So Fernie Santiago. We live in times characterized by political polarization. And an impartial historian can be conveniently categorized as belonging to one side, just on the basis of his honest analysis. Have you had to confront that issue?
Oh, beautiful question.
Yeah. Fortunately, it's not come up a lot. In fact, I think, just take Black Snow, for example. One of the things I really try to do with Black Snow is just lay out the story and let the reader make up their own mind. Because, historians do get accused of that. You're putting your thumb too much on the scale of what happened. And I think, the challenge, and look, as a commercial historian, this isn't a dissertation that I'm writing. I'm not here to prove a thesis or an academic point. I'm here to lay out what happened. And that is the distinction. That is the nice comfort I have as a commercial historian versus an academic one. That I can sort of catalog everything that happened and lay it all out there and leave it for the readers to make up their mind without having to have a big review of the historiography. Big review of the historiography and how mine's going to fit in differently. I love that because that's I don't have to do that. But Black Snow was a perfect example where I really felt like I laid it out, and a lot of the reviewers who were reviewing the book, and that's kind of, we use that as the barometer for what people think, came away and said, they saw both sides, and by that I mean they see the American point, but they also felt sympathy with some of the Japanese civilians who were sort of caught up at they do have this totalitarian government that's kind of running things. The civilians are kind of caught up in all this, and so they kind of walk out with it just kind of like and that's kind of how I wanted it to be. I don't want to be putting my thumb on the scale of it one way or the other. I do want to leave it up to the readers and it's always amazing to me the things that readers take away that I didn't even intend for readers to take away, and the points that the things they read and read into it. So, great question, and that is one of the fortunate things of not being an academia.
We have to do a tour at 11 o'clock for the guests at the chapel. If you can stay, maybe you can join us at 11. But maybe we will have a few minutes to meet with you outside if they want pictures and their book signing there. But I would like to ask a very important question. Do you have a message to Filipinos? Have you come to love our country?
Oh,
and of course,
absolutely.
and the history majors. So what can you say to the young historians?
Look, you guys have this amazing culture. You have so much history here. It goes back, hundreds and hundreds of years. Really thousands of years. We met some of the Aita earlier this week with our tour. It's a wonderful mix from the Philippines to China, Malaysia, the American period, Spanish period, and whatnot. Don't look at TikTok. Get off your phones, read books, appreciate history. And I'll tell you, I've got two teenagers. I've got a soon-to-be 17-year-old and a soon-to-be 15-year-old. I know what it's like. Get off the devices and enjoy you guys have an amazing culture, amazing history. You're very, very fortunate. Enjoy it and learn it and study it.
Wow, there you go. Mr. James Scott.
Alright, makasaysayang gabi, Salamat po. Thank you, Mr. James Scott, for that wonderful interview. And we have some reactions from some of the people here, sa ating chat. I would like to read them at batiin natin bago tayo matapos, Salamat, Bujay, sa iyong pagtitiyaga, Sige, so let's read some of the comments, Ayan, so Ronnie Francisco, yan. Wala na po tayo registration ngayon, Hindi na tapos na yung pandemic. Jerwin Fajardo, Yersel, watching from Dipolog City. My mother, Vilma Briones Chua, makasaysayang gabi po, Dr. Shaw. Alam nyo, hanggang ngayon, hindi bumibitaw. 48 po ang nanonood. 48. Hindi bumibitaw. Maraming salamat po. No? Ayan. Doris Aragon, for watching from Sagada Mountain Province. Oo. Karen Joy Cadiz, magandang gabi. Watching from General Trias, nabanggit na to. Jerwin Fajardo, nabanggit na po pala ito. Ayan. Sino pa ba? Shijo Yorimoto Kingo. Yes, Shijo. Good evening, Professor Shao. Shout out, nanonood po kami dito nila ate sa Valenzuela City. Ayan po. Okay, sino pa? Okay, Karen Joy Cadiz, watching from General Trias, nabanggit na pala. AJ Nueva, Makasaysayan gabi, Professor, pa-shoutout po sa Wonky Official from Munting Mapino, Naik, Cavite. Ayan. Tapos, Las Piñas historian, watching here from the city of Las Piñas. Prince Panlilia, watching from Philippines. Ayan. Emi Almenanza, watching from Santa Rosa, Laguna. Arian Esguera, watching from Mexico, Pampanga. Maya Pabengi, Kekongan. Apoying Lensi Lakandula. Bala mo, kamag-anak ng Lakandulay ni. O Dion Carla Collis, watching from Mexico, Pampanga. Sino ba yung teacher nyo na nagpapa-load sa inyo nito for plastic, Maya, dadakal salamat kaya kakapatad ne. O, Clark Isa Akabad, pagbati mula sa Laguna. Miro Abala, pagbati at howdy from Mayon, Quezon City. Ayan. Sabi ni Alisa Kate Yumul, watching from Pampanga. Lujil Andrea Sampang, ini magkapampangan niya. Malbeko gang manosebleed ko, sayang plus. Sabi niya, manunod ako hanggang manosebleed daw siya, sayang plus. Rina Jade Reyes, watching from my house. No? Lujil Andrea Sampang, don't English me, I'm panic, sabi. Oh. Tiffany Lane, sabi niya kay Rina Jade Reyes, liban mo nepok, sabi niya, watching in my house. Leave from my house, liban mo nepok. Sabihin, alis, iwan mo na yan, labas ka na. Irish Ann Pangilinan, watching from here, posisyon ng mga santo. Ano yung posisyon ng mga santo? Posisyon ng mga santo. EDSA, Epipanyo de los Santos? Oh? Di ko alam. Oh. We'll greet you all, sabi ko, later. So just hold it. Don't nosebleed. Oh? Sabi ko. So sige, sino pa ba? Yeah, don't nosebleed. Nuelo Rosco, of course. Mahiyo Rosco. Ayan. Tapos sabi ni Tiffany Lane, Andrea Sampangelo. Tiffany Lane, sana walang quiz pagtapos nito. Haha, di ko man 19 dyan. Kayo talaga, mapagbiro kayo eh. Oh. Sabi ni Tiffany Lane, kulang ng OPA. Rizal Raul Reyes, kudos to the History Department of the LSU, Xiao Chua and James Scott. Sir Rizal Valenzuela is watching, my teacher from elementary, no? Magandang gabi po, Sir Rizal Valenzuela. Tiffany Lane, shout out. Hello, Tiffany Lane. Kyle's Dwayne M. Dison, bleeding is my nose, no? Kayo talaga, grabe naman kayo. Maganda yung libro niya again, no? Basahin nyo to. It's an easy reading for English, ano? If you know a little English, it's easy reading. Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila by James Scott. It has very beautiful stories. You should read it. Beautiful stories that are tragic and brutal, but to teach us that we should always avoid war and always seek the path of peace, because in the end, it's always the civilians who are the victims. Diba? Sheres Guerra. Radjo Colis, shout out from A. Rizal. Kenji De La Cruz, sabi niya, shout out po, kaluguranda kayo. Kaluguranda kamuhin. Diba? Trixie Mataga, giveaway. Hindi, akin to. Yan ay side ni Mr. James Scott. Diba? Diba? Anyway, thank you very much sa panunod ninyo, no? Kekong, yan. Rizal Valenzuela, may Bagarabi, Professor Xiao, Makasaysayang araw. Agbuybuyaak dito San Manuel. Salamat sa shoutout. Sa San Manuel. Si Hapon. Sino si Hapon? Pa-shoutout. Sabi, hapon ng pangalan. Si ano ba ito? Axel? Axel Tugano? Basta hapon ng pangalan, no? Ayan, no? Prince Ivan Ramin, ayan. Alright, ayan. Yaku pa, Ed Alexander Cunanan Gomez. Alan Poniente, thank you Philippines. Kaya, thank you Philippines. Princess Ira Gunyo, thanks po. Ngayon kayo nagsihabol sa shoutout. Ngayon magpapaalam na ako. Overtime na kami. Magagalit na si Budjay Sedutan. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat sa pakikinig ninyo. Ito naman take away ko na para sa ating gabing ito. Mga kaibigan, napanood nyo yung una natuto tayo ng paano ba yung pagre-research ng isang libro tungkol sa digmaan. Pangalawa, nagkaroon tayo ng mga pananaw ukol sa nangyaring digmaan, ano yung nangyari, at yung mga leksyon ng digmaan na ito, no? Yun nga, yung banggaan ng mga personalidad, no? Yamashita, MacArthur, nakaka-apekto din pa rin yan sa atin, yung big man history. Pero ang ganda rin tingnan, yung mga naranasan ng mga individual na tao. I think yun yung balance nung Rampage, na libro ni James Scott, that na importante pa rin yung mga leader, tinitingnan natin mga leader, pero importante din nakasama sa konsiderasyon natin sa kwento yung mga nasa laylayan. Ayan, Irish Ann Pangilinan. Mo ko buming shoutout, kay abasa ing lagyo mo. Hindi ko mabasa. Michael Jan, shoutout kang Collis Ranjo. Prince Ivan Ramin. Sige, sana merong Rampage sa Shopee. Merong Rampage sa Shopee. Please, pag sobrang mura nung Rampage sa Shopee, fake yun, ha? May mga fake kasi. Pero kung gusto nilang basahin, hindi okay. Pero may fake. May mga original copy dyan kahit second hand, no? Tanungin nyo muna kung original copy o ano lang siya, photocopy. Rina Jade Reyes, yan, Kuya Labies, Irish Ann, Caleb Poniente, nabanggit na kita kanina, Radyo Collis, salamat sa Dion Carla Collis. Okay, magsabi kayo kung sinong prop nyo. Sige, magpapaalam na po ako. Ako po si Xiao Chuan na nagsasabing ang kasaysayan ay di basta-basta kwento. Meron itong metodo, magtanong, mag-imbestiga at magkumpara at lagi po nanyong tatandaan ang kasaysayan. Ang kasaysayan ay Kaysaya. Ako po si Xiao Chua. Bye-bye.
Sa puso't isip laging kukupkupin mga gunitang sa ating nakarating. Bayan pukawin sa diwa't damdamin. Pangarap ng kahapoy ating tuparin. Marami pang bagay ang dapat tuntunin. Mga aral ng nakalipas ay susulatin. Malayong kahapoy sisikapin pang libutin. Nalalaman ay atin pang pauunlarin. Salam sa kaibig-ibig mong layunin. Padayon sa iyong pagiging tinig ng kahapong nagnanais na marinig. Ng ngayon at ng bukas may pagtatanggol, sarili ng may lalim. Salam sa kaibig-ibig mong layunin, padayon sa iyong pagiging tinig ng kahapon at nanais na marinig, ng ngayon at ng bukas na darating. Luwit ka mananalaysay sa iyong papel, turuan ang mga kababayan na daigig, agam-agam sa sarili, dangal papag-alabin, kabayan, bayan na kabutihan landasin. Mabuhay ka, kapisanan, kasaysayan ng Pilipinas.